Welcome to another InRange Patreon-supported Q&A. These questions are all brought to you by Patreon and Utreon supporters who are very generous in keeping InRange alive. We are demonetized, no sponsors, no overlords, no advertising, no embedded ads, only you the viewer. This month I decided to do something a little different. I wanted to focus the Q&A on a specific topic. I'm going to try and do this once in a while if possible. And this month I decided to do one that's a historical topic we've dealt with a lot here on InRange, and that's Tombstone, Arizona, Wyatt Earp, the OK Corral gunfight, and issues surrounding that. So one of the things here is Earp is a very mystified character, and he's become really mythological in terms of his approach in American culture, even up to and including advertisements for guns this year at SHOT Show, which we'll talk about later in the video. So I got some questions here from supporters, and let's see what we can do to clarify history a little bit. Sean S. Who is the person that is passed off as Doc Holliday in most photos, and what is the history around that? So this is an interesting one because you're going to find that when you look up Doc Holliday, you're going to find this one very startling photo of a man with very dark eyes and the, very specific mustache that everyone associates with Doc Holliday. And that person is represented as Doc Holliday all over Tombstone itself with postcards on walls. You'll see this picture in historical documentaries on the History Channel, etc. You'll find him in books. You'll find him all over the place. And the truth is, we know it's not Doc Holliday. The photo that is representative of Doc Holliday over and over again and misrepresentative of Doc Holliday is a guy named John Escapool. Escapool was one of the founders or one of the early frontiersmen in Tombstone, Arizona, and was fairly prominent and successful in that city in the 1880s. And his photo is quite startling, and you'll see it here. And I can see why people think it's Doc Holliday, but that is not Doc Holliday. It is interesting that Escapool is still around as a family in Tombstone. In fact, the current mayor, and they've been doing this for a long time, are still the Escapools, going all the way back to John himself. And there's graffiti in the mines. When you were in the mines, eventually they were issuing carbide lamps, and those were used to illuminate your way. And they would produce a lot of black soot, and you would draw graffiti in the mines. And in some of the lower levels of the Tombstone mines, there's actually the Escapool names down there as graffiti. But the picture that is so frequently represented as Doc Holliday isn't Doc Holliday at all. It's Escapool. He came in 1877, well, at least the area, to be a local timber hauler. But he ended up buying ranches, a mill, and according to some reports, gave the land for the old city cemetery, not Boot Hill, the city cemetery, and him and his wife are buried there in 1926. But John's great-grandson, Dusty Escapool, is the once and current, as in of this year, mayor of Tombstone, Arizona. So that's who you see all the time being represented as Doc Holliday, and it's not him. Orion Hullinger. Why are the Earps so prolific in Western lore, and where did it start? This is a good question, and during his day, Wyatt Earp was actually not that well known a character. In fact, you'll see in many movies and things when you watch it, Wyatt Earp comes in town and he says his name. In fact, even in Tombstone, and people in town are just astonished that Wyatt Earp's there. They're like, "Oh, Wyatt Earp, huh?" As though he was some sort of really famous figure in his day. And the truth is, he really wasn't all that famous in his day, especially in the early 1880s. Wyatt Earp and the Earps in general really did live the quintessential frontier life existence. I mean, Wyatt Earp at one point was a horse thief and an outlaw, and then an outlaw again, and a lawman, and was a gambler, and ran gambling tables, and was a pimp, and was also a buffalo hunter. And he did all of those things in his lifespan. And in that regard, whether you like Wyatt Earp or do not like Wyatt Earp, he's a very interesting historical character, as are really the rest of his family. So in regards to him being an iconic Western figure, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and I think it's hard to debate that he's not. He lived one of the most iconic Western lives you could think of, and in that scope of his duration, even being a miner later in his life. I mean, this guy kind of did it all. So in regards to his life being an example of what the frontier was, he's a good example of that. So I think that that's part of it. But the truth is, he wasn't really famous until after his death. I mean, he was a little famous before that, maybe I should say infamous, and we'll get to that more later in the video. But what really did it was this book right here, Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal by Stuart Lake, and was published in 1931. In the late 20s and 1930s, there was a renaissance of interest in the Old West. Same thing we see nowadays with like the 1980s, right? Nostalgia is always a thing in human culture, history, and experience. So you go back a couple decades and suddenly things were better then than they are now. And in the 1930s, that was happening with the Old West. And you'll see, of course, the golden era of Old West films, cowboy movies, John Wayne, 1930s up to the 1950s and 60s. And this book by Stuart Lake was one of the quintessential books that was part of that movement. Now, Wyatt Earp, just before his death, was trying to essentially rectify and clarify what he felt was a bad name that he acquired through his life, rightfully or wrongfully so. And he was working with an author named John Flood Jr., and they're called the John Flood Transcripts. And John Flood was going to write the correct, according to Wyatt Earp, biography of his life and clarify a lot of the things that have been plaguing him for his lifetime in terms of being nefarious or infamous. But that book never quite made it out. Wyatt Earp died through the process of writing the transcripts with John Flood Jr., and those transcripts sort of just sat around and rotted. However, Stuart Lake got a hold of them and then turned them into a fictional book, and this is a fictional book, based on the true life transcriptions that were coming out of John Flood Jr.'s transcripts. So he took the general story and then embellished on it to the point where it is hard to discern fact from fiction in Stuart Lake's book, Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal. And that's one of the things we're dealing with till today. Almost all of the Wyatt Earp narratives that have come ever since this book was written are based on this book. And it is full of embellishments and flourishing and things that are not true to make it a much more exciting read and palatable to the people that were thirsty and hungry for really exciting Old West stories in the 1930s. So if you want to look at the point in which Wyatt Earp became famous, really famous, it was this book. And then every piece of Hollywood that came after it is based on this book. And therefore, the general common knowledge and understanding of Wyatt Earp is based on this book, which is based on relatively true transcripts, or at least as true as Wyatt Earp purported them to be. They are more truthful than what's in this book, post his death, in an attempt to clarify his, quote, good name. His wife, who survived him, really tried to do that as well as profit off of the John Flood Jr. Transcripts and this book. Wyatt Earp never saw a dime off of any of it. Max S. The Bottled and Bond Act of 1897 was the first food regulation that put control on tobacco to iodine and whiskey. What was the whiskey of choice for Earp and the West of the time? Well, that's an interesting point. Wyatt Earp actually was a teetotaler. Wyatt Earp did not drink, and many of the movies and such do accurately represent that. In fact, they show him going into the bar and asking for coffee instead of whiskey. So, to answer your question, first of all, what whiskey did Wyatt Earp drink? And the answer is none. He had a bad problem with alcohol in his earlier years after his first wife, Urilla, passed away from disease, and he fought with the bottle and was able, to his credit, to beat it and never drank again. So Earp did not have a preferred whiskey. That said, the preferred whiskey of Tombstone in general was a mass-produced product called Old Overholt, and it was wildly common across the Southwest and the, quote, Old West, mostly because the Old Overholt factory could produce large volumes of the substance. So that really was the most common whiskey you would have found in the Old West, and it is pretty prolific, and it would have been the case in Tombstone, even if Wyatt Earp himself didn't partake of any of it. Sean S. During the fight at the OK Corral, what was the caliber of the shotgun used? Was it 12 gauge or 10 gauge? No info I have seen ever said what it was. So one of the things I'll rectify here, which is not the question being asked, is that the gunfight at the OK Corral wasn't called originally the gunfight at the OK Corral. It was originally referred to, even by the Earps, as the difficulty on Fremont Street. It was considered a street fight. The actual fight really happened on Fremont Street at the rear entrance that would go south and then east and then into the OK Corral. It was theoretically a backdoor sort of alley that led to the OK Corral, but it didn't happen at the OK Corral. In fact, it would have been more accurate to call it the gunfight at the Fly's boarding house and photography studio, which had happened right next to. But it eventually became the gunfight at the OK Corral because that sounds a lot cooler, and it's sort of weird to walk around and say the fight that happened on Fremont Street near blah blah blah. So it really wasn't the fight at the OK Corral or the gunfight at the OK Corral. It was really the difficulty on Fremont Street. But in regards to the shotgun was used by Doc Holliday in the fight, and he caused a rather significant and very quickly mortal wound to one of the opponents with it. It was most likely a cheap Belgian Meteor, and it was most definitely a 10 gauge, not a 12 gauge. Back in the quote Old West, 10 gauge shotguns were far more common than 12 gauge, especially for combative purposes. They would refer to it as the street howitzer, and it was definitely a 10 gauge shotgun. In fact, it can be argued, at least in regards to the forensic analysis of the fight, and this has been done, the gentleman who was killed by Doc Holliday with the shotgun was hit in his side, right here, while ostensibly reaching over a horse in an attempt to get a Winchester carbine out of its scabbard. He was not armed, did not have a handgun, and while he was reaching over the horse to get the carbine out of the scabbard, that's when Holliday lit him up on the side with the shotgun, and the pellet path is represented by that even in the original forensic analysis. So it is pretty easy to argue that the man that was killed by Doc Holliday was not armed and was attempting to get a gun once the gunfight started, and was killed essentially in a disarmed state, well, yes, reaching for a carbine once bullets had started flying. Marlene, this is tangential. Feel free to ignore, but what do you think of the Tombstone rifle and its advertisement? And they provided a YouTube link. So, POF recently came out with a 9mm lever action, a modern lever action gun. They call it the Tombstone, and they put out an advertisement for it. And I watched the video. And yeah, that video right there represents the reality of the modern mythology of Wyatt Earp and the Old West versus the reality. It shows this cowboy-looking guy riding into an old town. In fact, I know where they filmed it. They filmed it in Cowtown, which is near Phoenix. It's pretty obvious when they're doing the shooting. And they talk about how men like, Wyatt Earp and the lawmen tamed the West and Tombstone, and they did it with their trusty lever guns.
There's still a town out west that was built on silver and made infamous by the gunslingers iron and lead. Legendary for its lawmen and their righteous protection of family and friends in the face of tyranny and terror. Home to cowboys who were tougher than nails and stronger than steel. POF USA is proud to present the Tombstone.
The look of the town is old and decrepit with decaying wood. Tombstone would have been a very rich, fancy place, very posh. In fact, it was considered the equal to, if not going to exceed, the beauty of San Francisco at the time. So it didn't look like a rugged old town. And in this commercial, they even referred to them as fighting tyranny. I watched this commercial and I just kind of really didn't know what to make of it. First of all, it plays into the trope of the lawman coming into this destroyed town, ravaged by crime, and curing it with his gun. And while he's doing it, he's fighting tyranny at the same time. And the reality of the conflict that happened in Tombstone was a political one between Republicans and Democrats, a vie for power over the city and its economy, as well as some bad dealings gone awry with a relatively corrupt law enforcement organization that illegalized the carry of guns in town, except for their friends and themselves, and then landed up killing 3 people and going on a vigilante ride over the enforcement of what was ostensibly a misdemeanor. So how that's turned into the lawman coming into town to save it from crime and using his trusty lever gun to end tyranny is an interesting question, but it is the common American understanding and mythology around Wyatt Earp and the Old West, and the recent commercial of the Tombstone lever gun by POF absolutely represents all of those inappropriate understandings and plays directly into them. Teddy, what is a little detail or tidbit about the gunfight and the parties involved that a lot of pop culture has actually gotten surprisingly right? I think the thing that is most correct in almost every rendition of the difficulty on Fremont Street and the conflict in Tombstone was the different cultural identities of the two gangs that were involved. The Earp gang were urbanized city folk that wore dapper clothes and lived in the city and were gamblers and pimps and all the things that came with urbanization. They ran and owned mines, for example, and lived predominantly in the urban environment of the city. The cowboy gang was predominantly a cattle gang, yes, a cattle rustling gang as well, and they lived a very rural life. And they came into town and were maybe a little more dusty, and maybe their clothes weren't quite as nice. And they really weren't in town all that often. More often than not, the cowboys, which by the way was a derogatory term at the time, cow-boys was something that was a slur. It meant kind of like a rural dirtbag, kind of like we would use sometimes redneck now as a slur. They would not have called themselves that really that much at the time, but they were called the cowboys then by the opposition. They didn't have the money and financial power of the Earps or people that lived in very posh, very expensive Tombstone. So generally speaking, when you look at Tombstone, any of the movies that have come out, even in the 50s, the bad guys, in air quotes, the cowboys come into town, and they're rural and kind of dusty, and they're cattle rustlers or wranglers. And the Earps are generally demonstrated as pretty dapper with nice hats and good clothing. I would say that's the one consistency that they've gotten mostly right through almost every discussion of this topic. Nick B. After the vendetta ride by some of the Earps and Doc Holliday amongst others, it is my understanding that they did not and could not return to Tombstone because there were warrants out for their arrest. Whatever became of those charges, and was Wyatt Earp forced to avoid Arizona, or at least Tombstone, for the rest of his days? And that is exactly, absolutely correct. So, after the difficulty on Fremont Street, there were two revenge killings that occurred, or attempted revenge killings. One was successful against Morgan Earp while they were playing billiards in the Campbell and Hatch billiard pool hall. Morgan was leaning over a pool table and took a round through his back that exited his body and landed up in George Barry's leg. And another round was fired at Wyatt Earp, which missed right above his head. They did succeed in killing Morgan Earp. A little later, an attempt was made against Virgil Earp, where a number of people armed with shotguns in a construction site across from the Oriental Saloon opened up on Virgil Earp across the street when he was crossing between the Oriental and the Crystal Palace. He was presumably mortally wounded, and the parties involved fled. However, he survived. His left arm was permanently disabled and flopped around the rest of his life. He could never control it. In fact, the doctor at the time recommended removing his left arm, but he insisted that they would not. He was later still a lawman, and his arm just flapped around and was dysfunctional, so he only had the use of his right hand and right arm. But no charges were ever filed for the people that fired the shots on Morgan Earp, or killed Morgan Earp, or fired the shots on Virgil Earp, because they were never identifiable and there was no evidence against anyone to form formal charges. There was investigation and research, and there was an attempt to see if they should file charges, but they were never ever able to identify the parties involved to file those charges. So therefore, we are not sure till this day who pulled the trigger on Morgan Earp or who pulled the triggers on Virgil Earp. However, Wyatt realized or believed that he knew who the parties were involved, and the first person they killed after that was Frank Stillwell in Tucson, Arizona, while they were transporting the body of Morgan Earp to California to the rest of the family. Frank Stillwell was located near the train station in Tucson. He was there ostensibly to be there for a court hearing for something else not involved with the Earps. People said they saw him there for that, and his body was found riddled with bullets, lots of bullets, near the train tracks in Tucson, as the first quote-unquote vigilante killing, or vendetta killing, or revenge killing, or straight-up murder that was done by Wyatt Earp and party. After the killing of Frank Stillwell, they knew, and people realized, and there was enough eyewitnesses, etc., to know that Wyatt Earp and party had been the people who pulled the trigger on Frank Stillwell, and formal legal murder charges were filed against Wyatt Earp. At that point, he was no longer legally a law enforcement officer and was an outlaw. The rest of the vigilante ride and the vendetta ride was done under outlaw status, and other parties were actually seeking him out and trying to arrest him for the murder and the legal warrant placed against him for Frank Stillwell. So it is interesting to note that there were no legal warrants issued for the people who killed Morgan or wounded Virgil, but there was a warrant for the murder of Frank Stillwell placed against Wyatt Earp et al., the party in general, and he was at that point an outlaw and evading the law himself during the vendetta ride, while he killed others, potentially Curly Bill Brocious and a few more. It is for that reason that when they felt they had completed their vendetta ride, the Earp party and the vendetta party did not stay in Arizona. Doc fled for Colorado, Wyatt moved out to California and Nevada, and Alaska, Nevada, California, when he ended up passing away in 1929. And while there are supposedly pictures or rumors of Wyatt coming back discreetly to Arizona, he never really probably came back to Arizona because those warrants for his arrest for the murder of Frank Stillwell were still active. He was an outlaw in Arizona for the rest of his life and did not return to Arizona. Virgil Earp, who was not part of the vendetta ride, did not have charges against him, and he did return to Arizona at least a few times. So Virgil Earp continued to be a lawman post the difficulty on Fremont Street, was not a party to the actual vendetta ride, and had no charges against him. Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp and others, however, were outlaws and fled Arizona territory due to that outlaw status. Nick B. I thought it was mythical, but a couple decades ago I read an article that at least somewhat convincingly that Edward Judson, aka Ned Buntline, did gift a long barrel Colt to Wyatt Earp and a few other lawmen, and Earp used his at the OK Corral. What say you? So for you that don't know this is part of the legend of Wyatt Earp, that in the gunfight at the OK Corral, or the difficulty on Fremont Street, Wyatt used a very long barrel Colt 45 called a Buntline Special. No, I do not believe that that's the case whatsoever. We know for a fact he didn't use it at the OK Corral or the gunfight itself, because per Earp's own testimony and others, while he was walking up to the fight, he had placed the revolver he used in the fight in his pocket, his jacket pocket. Now, those were big pockets in their day, but they weren't Buntline pockets. And so whatever revolver was used at the actual gunfight, it was definitely not a Buntline Special. That gun does not exist anywhere in any collector space that I'm aware of, and I believe it to be completely mythological and created by people like Stuart Lake. Brian J. Speaking on fights, what's your take on the outcome of the Fitzsimmons versus Sharkey boxing match? Well, this is an interesting one. Probably a lot of people don't realize this, but one of the other things that Wyatt Earp did intermittently to create money for himself during his long Old West career was to be a referee for boxing events. He did it throughout his life, starting in the 1860s, and doing it up until later in his life during, for example, the Fitzsimmons boxing match, which occurred on December 2nd, 1896 in San Francisco. Now, this is all very interesting because let's go ahead and start with a little bit more information about Wyatt Earp in this regard. Prize fighting was actually illegal within the city limits of San Francisco, which is where Wyatt Earp was living at the time. Therefore, he accepted the job as a referee for any legal event violating city law in the city he lived in to be this referee. Not only that, when he got into the ring to referee the match, he was carrying an illegally concealed revolver, which was noticed, and he was disarmed from it and continued to referee in spite of that, and was actually fined $50 for the illegal carrying of a concealed weapon within city limits while refereeing an illegal prize fighting match within the city limits of San Francisco. Let me remind you, if you're thinking about earlier in the video, that the original difficulty on Fremont Street, the gunfight at the OK Corral, was because the Earps were trying to enforce a law about carrying firearms within city limits, Ordinance Number 9, within Tombstone, which was a misdemeanor. 3 men died for that, and more died afterwards during the Vendetta ride. But Wyatt Earp saw fit to carry a revolver illegally concealed, in spite of his supposed lawman status, even up to and including going into the ring in San Francisco in 1896. Now, whatever you think of carrying in spite of the law, I'm not even going into that. But I am pointing out a very stark hypocrisy in terms of his life and behavior. Now, during the match, he called the match for hitting below the belt, and he called it very early during the actual event, and no one else saw this supposed punch below the belt. And so controversial was his call as a referee that the vast majority of people believed this match to be a corrupt call, and that it was a thrown match, and that it was fixed for people to garner and gain money from it. No one saw this punch below the belt that he called, and he became sort of a laughingstock, in fact, as a result of this, what was obviously a fixed call in a match. Now, whether or not Wyatt Earp himself made money off of this is unclear. However, it was so controversial, and so much of the media made fun of him for refereeing this illegal match and then calling this violation of the rules, that it became a joke in the newspapers. In fact, there's comic strips made about this Wyatt Earp and his refereeing of this match and how ridiculous it was. So there you go. This is what people thought of Wyatt Earp later in his life. This is 1896. This is the gunfight happened many years before that, over a decade before that. 1881, October 26th, 1881, and still in 1896, Earp is sort of a laughing stock. He's on the run from the law in Arizona, refereeing a match in San Francisco, which appears to be a thrown match with some sort of corruption involved. In fact, so synonymous was corruption with refereeing a match that terms became commonplace called pulling an Earp or Earping the job, which was a reference for throwing a match or corruption in general. So if you were corrupt, that was called Earping the job or pulling an Earp. That tells you what people thought about Wyatt Earp in the 1890s. 8 years after the actual boxing match, the doctor who supposedly treated Sharkey after the match said that it was indeed rigged. He knew that it was rigged, and he himself made money on it. It was unclear on what Earp made, if he did, on it, but it was a rigged match. Earp made a very weird, controversial call about something that no one else actually witnessed, and Earp, his name became synonymous with corruption in regards to pulling an Earp or Earping the job. And then this book comes out in 1930s, and now we see advertisements for the Tombstone lever gun and movies like Tombstone that show him as this heroic, valiant hero. Of all the film versions of Earp's life and the difficulty on Fremont Street, none of them are perfect. The closest one, I believe, that I've ever seen is actually Kevin Costner's Wyatt Earp. While Tombstone is a really fun, beautiful movie, and I would say it's one of the best cowboy movies of all time, Westerns, it is definitely the mythological version that you see in this book. Kevin Costner's movie Wyatt Earp tries to do better, and even so, they do better of the gunfight itself. In the movie Tombstone, everyone seems to show Ike Clanton, who is disarmed, running it up to Wyatt Earp saying, don't shoot, I'm disarmed. And Earp did actually push him to the side and says something along the lines of, the fight is commenced, get the fighting or run away. And Ike did, he ran away. In real life, he ran away. And in the Kevin Costner movie, they show Ike running away. But in the movie Tombstone, they show Ike going into Fly's boarding house and photography studio, grabbing a gun and shooting at them through the windows. Absolutely did not happen. We know that did not happen. Many eyewitnesses of this gunfight occurred, and that absolutely was not the case. Additionally, the Kevin Costner's movie Wyatt Earp shows Virgil, Doc Holliday, and Morgan being wounded in the gunfight. Wyatt Earp was the only person not wounded in this fight, and he stood still and just exchanged bullets or shots with people. All three of Morgan was shot through the shoulder, Virgil was nicked in the leg, and Doc Holliday was shot through the hip. All of them recovered from that, but all three of them were wounded. And that is the only movie I've seen that actually accurately portrays that. So that's interesting as well. Well, this is a little bit shorter Q&A, but it's a very focused one. I hope you found this deep dive into Tombstone and the wider mythology to be interesting. I'd like to thank the Patreons for their questions in this regard and inspiring these answers. And hopefully we'll do more focused Q&As in the future on different topics, not necessarily the Old West, but I'll pick one and we'll see what we get. I think it's a little more interesting, and I have to admit that for me, this one was a little more fun and a little more interesting because being focused allows us to kind of laser in on something. So we'll see what we'll do next month. But if you'd like to ask these types of questions, please consider supporting InRange on Patreon or Utreon. I do solicit the questions from both sites. If you can't, I do understand. Please just subscribe to the channel and share with your friends. Thanks for watching.